Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video, and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. So today I'm coming at you with a very detailed and thorough analysis of the recent Tradwive trend that's been taking over social media, and this is going to be a long video, so I'm purposefully keeping this intro short. So this is your warning: if you don't like long videos, this one's not for you. A lot of people have done deep dives into this, but I hope that I can offer something new to the conversation, or maybe just like a different perspective, as well as a bit of personal background, because once upon a time I almost got sucked into the Tradwive universe too. So I kind of have a perspective from both of those sides. Although that was like 10 years ago when the world was a little less scary and before TikTok was around, so it was a lot easier for me to disengage with that kind of content as soon as I realized how toxic it was. But more on that later. Recently, an article was published in the New York Post about a couple who had been married for 12 years and were getting divorced because the husband watched too many Tradwife TikToks and started believing that he was entitled to a submissive wife who stayed at home and looked after the house and kids. The wife was baffled because in all the time they'd been together, she'd always worked, and her husband had always been okay with and even encouraged and supported her in her career. But all of a sudden, he became critical, comparing her to the fictionalized Tradwife personas that he was seeing on social media, and she finally left him, as she rightly should have, when the criticism started turning into like actual verbal abuse. The internet then lost its collective mind over this article, so of course I had to put in my 2 cents. In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive into the Tradwife movement, what it's all about, where it comes from, what it's actually romanticizing, and what's at the heart of it all. At the end, I'm going to offer some concrete solutions that people on both the left and the right can hopefully get on board with, so stick around to the end for a little bit of hope and positivity, because this is going to get dark at some points. You've been warned. Also, just a little disclaimer before we actually get into it: I have nothing against anyone who wants to stay home and look after their families. If you're in a safe, supportive relationship and in a financial position to do that, and that's what you want to do, then power to you. I think you deserve to be getting paid for your domestic labor. I don't think you should be expected to do it for free or in exchange for like a roof over your head and food on the table, but I'll get into that later. My point is that I have nothing against stay-at-home wives and moms writ large. I was raised by a stay-at-home mom, and I have friends who are stay-at-home moms, and they seem pretty happy with their lives and their choices, and that is awesome, and I am happy for them. I'm not talking about you guys. Who I am talking about, however, are the Tradwives of TikTok and how they glorify patriarchy, white supremacy, and nationalism while spreading dangerous misinformation and perpetuating conspiracy theories online. As far as I know, neither my mom or any of the other stay-at-home moms and wives I know in real life have done that. As far as I know, but you guys can let me know if that's different. What is a Tradwife? Okay, so what is a Tradwife exactly? Let's start out by defining some terms here. Tradwife is an amalgamation of the words traditional and wife, and it's exactly what it sounds like. A Tradwife is a woman who practices traditional gender roles in her home, which can include things like doing all the cooking and cleaning, being the primary caregiver for any children in the home, wearing floral feminine dresses, and submitting to her husband's authority.
My husband gets the final say. So if I want to make a bigger purchase, and I'm not talking grocery shopping, I mean something extra, I always go to him first anyways, but if he says no and puts his foot down, then the answer is no.
There's a distinct pipeline from things like cottagecore and other alternative living spaces online to alt-right Tradwife spaces. Cottagecore videos started cropping up online around 2017, but they became super popular in 2020 when we were all stuck inside because of a certain global event that had us all stuck inside for a while. Cottagecore aesthetics depict charming pastoral scenes featuring women in long, floaty dresses, baking bread, sipping tea in porcelain cups, reading in cozy spots, and tending to their gardens. Originally popular with the queer community, cottagecore was practically synonymous with sapphic spaces.
And the values of cottagecore lesbians aren't new. In the 1970s and 80s, there were communities of back-to-the-land lesbians, or land dykes. These communities were about connecting with the natural and valuing lesbian self-sufficiency and strength and community. When a cottagecore lesbian puts on a pair of dungarees or grows herbs on their windowsill, they're connecting with this lesbian legacy.
In recent years, it's been co-opted by fascists on TikTok. The TikTok trend. TikTok is where the whole Tradwife movement really found its legs, and it's only been in the last 3 years or so that it's begun to take over what used to be queer-friendly spaces. A 2023 study by the Global Network on Extremism and Technology found that cottagecore had been co-opted by several neo-fascist movements, including Tradwives, white nationalists, and eco-fascists, as an aesthetic touchpoint for exposure to online extremist content. Unless you're very media literate, it's easy to get sucked into this pipeline. The whole idea of cottagecore is to romanticize a mythical agrarian past where bread was baked from scratch and fresh produce was harvested from abundantly evergreen gardens, and life was lived simply, free from the constant surveillance of modern technology and the grim realities of work under late-stage capitalism. It was meant as an escape, a fantasy into which we could lose ourselves during the uncertainty of the global event that had us all stuck inside. I can't say the word on my YouTube channel because I'm monetized now, so they're gonna ding me if I say stuff like that. So hence the euphemisms. Because cottagecore was originally meant to be read as fantasy, it deliberately ignores the actual realities of our agrarian past, such as a lack of access to healthcare, sexism and misogyny, ceaseless childbearing, religious dogma, and racism. But the Tradwives who have co-opted cottagecore don't ignore these things. They actually view them as positive things that we should strive to emulate in the present. That's what makes them so dangerous. Imagine this. You're a young woman scrolling through TikTok to catch a bit of a break from all the worries that your mind is constantly overloaded with. Then you come across a video of a woman your age running barefoot through a field of lavender in a long white dress carrying a basket. It's soothing. It's aspirational. I wish that was me, you think, so you give the video a like. Then, all of a sudden, you're seeing more and more videos like that. The algorithm knows you're enjoying this kind of content, so it keeps on feeding it to you. The videos get more and more political. In some of them, the women talk about drinking unpasteurized milk and how the Western medical establishment can't be trusted. Then they talk about traditional gender roles, about serving their husbands and submitting to their authority, while showing images of glossy 1950s ads depicting happy, smiling housewives. Before you know it, you're seeing video after video like this, and you start thinking, that sounds kind of nice. I wouldn't mind giving up control of my life to someone else in exchange for security and not having to keep doing this stressful, soul-sucking grind every day. And then before you know it, you're hooked. Let me tell you something. We'd all rather be baking bread all day than go to work for someone else. Cottagecore videos on TikTok were meant to be reactionary and a commentary on how unhealthy our modern lives have become. But the Tradwives of TikTok have taken over that space and used it to further their neo-fascist white nationalist agenda, presenting their ideology as the solution to our collective woes about precarious work, supply chain issues, and the soaring costs of living. The original cottagecore accounts and influencers that served as a safe space for the queer community and for queer women specifically were meant to be a visual escape from those things, with the understanding that this isn't real, it never was real, it's just a bit of performance art to make us all momentarily forget about the miseries of late-stage capitalism. The horrors of modern life. One thing that Tradwives are absolutely correct about is that modern life kind of sucks, especially if you're a young person. I'm kind of at like the upper limit of what could still be considered a young person, but I still have enough of my life ahead of me, hopefully, to completely empathize with that feeling of terror and dread when you gaze into the future and realize that you're probably not going to have the stable 9-to-5 that your parents and teachers promised you growing up, and it's probably going to take you a lifetime to pay off your student loans, and jobs that offer a living wage and some actual dignity are really hard to come by, let alone get, and no one can afford a house or knows how to be in a relationship anymore. I remember that feeling of complete terror and vulnerability when I was in my last year of university, realizing that I was about to graduate and there was no script anymore for how I should live my life. Up until then, the next step had always been obvious. All I had to worry about was getting through the semester, getting through exams, getting good grades. I knew that after middle school came high school, and after high school came university, but after university came what? What was I supposed to do now? I graduated university in 2012, a few years after the 2008 financial crash, and there were no jobs, like none. It took me 7 years after graduating to finally get a job even remotely connected to what I had done in school, and even then I had to go back and do a postgraduate degree to get it. It was so scary being thrown out into a world where employment was precarious at best, and where the only jobs available to me wouldn't even begin to pay the bills, let alone afford me the opportunity to save money or invest or start to build some kind of like stable foundation for myself. You could argue that every young person has to struggle at first, and that's normal, but there's a big difference between working an entry-level job in your field that requires you to work a little extra hard for a while and working a casual minimum wage job that doesn't and never will pay the bills or offer any kind of security no matter how long or how hard you work. During my last year of school, I was in between relationships, and I found myself romanticizing the idea of traditional gender roles and being a stay-at-home wife and mother. As embarrassing as it is to admit that, I know what it's like to be young and scared. I watched hours and hours of the Duggars on TLC, telling myself that my obsession with their life was because they were so bizarre, when really deep down inside, I envied the way that everything was just laid out for them.
God talks about a wife doing her husband good and not evil all the days of her life. And I think that is what I say to my girls.
Imagine how easy life would be if all you had to worry about was marrying someone who could take care of you and then devoting yourself completely to your marriage and family. Sounds like a breeze compared to the terrifying soul-sucking process of job hunting followed by precarious employment if I was lucky. So I get it. I get the temptation to retreat into traditional gender roles. The world is a very scary place right now and getting scarier every year. Like, it's much scarier for those Gen Z girlies who are like 18, 19, 20 than it was for me when I was 21, 22 years old. Climate change, global wars, inflation, the cost of living crisis, the rise of AI, lack of access to healthcare, household and student debt, all overseen by ineffective leaders who aren't doing much or can't do much to address any of these things in any sort of constructive way. It's a lot. I don't blame anyone for just wanting to retreat into a bubble of idealized domestic bliss and bake pies. Unfortunately, though, retreating is not helpful. It's not going to solve anything, but I'll get to that later. My point is that while the challenges we face are certainly unique and unprecedented in many ways, anxieties over shifting social norms and values definitely is not. Historically, whenever society is undergoing a massive shift of some kind, there's always a backlash motivated by a fear of the unknown and an uncertainty about one's place in the emerging social order. We see this during the French Revolution when there were waves of backlash and counter-revolutionary takeovers perpetrated by those who were still loyal to the monarchy. And it wasn't just rich people who were lashing out. A lot of the backlash against the revolution came from poor and working class people who had been terrorized under the extremism of the new regime. In the early 1900s, when the suffragette movement started to become more mainstream, there was a lot of anti-feminist propaganda as well. Anti-suffragism was a movement that was led by women in the US, Canada, Australia, and Ireland. They hosted rallies and events that drew huge crowds, and they argued in favor of domestic feminism, which was the idea that women had complete freedom within the home and therefore didn't need it in the public sphere as well. Kind of sounds like Tradwives if you ask me. My point is, backlash against social and political progress is nothing new. Change is scary and made scarier still by the addition of all the problems created by late-stage capitalism. It's not the woke left who are eroding society with our feminism and blue hair and Pride Month celebrations. It's late-stage capitalism and the unchecked greed of multinational corporations who have a vested interest in keeping us poor and afraid so that they can continue to exploit our labor and keep us dependent on them for the crumbs that they deign to throw our way. But instead of confronting the real enemy, we're just blaming each other for our problems and retreating into these reactionary online spaces that glorify some idealized, mythologized past when things weren't so bad. Except that they were, we just don't talk about that part. The mythologized past. The whole Tradwife movement is built on the idea that in some golden-aged past, life was simpler and therefore better. Men went to work to provide for their families, and women stayed at home to nurture their children, tend to their gardens, and bake sourdough bread from scratch. Everyone was happy and fulfilled. Definitely no one had any mental health issues or suffered from things like trauma, psychosis, and depression. And those pesky queer and trans people didn't exist, and no one needed feminism because women were all cared for and protected by their loving, doting husbands who definitely were not traumatized from the war and taking out all their anger and aggression on their families. Ah yes, life was so beautiful back then. To illustrate this glorified past, Tradwives on TikTok often post images from the 1950s showing smiling, beautiful women in pearls and dresses and perfectly coiffed hair spending time with their families and going to church and catering to their husbands. But the thing is, all of these images that are used to lure women into this false idea of an easy, beautiful life are advertisements. They're not real, and they never were real. They were created in the 1940s and 50s to sell products, and now they're being used to sell a lifestyle that's fundamentally unhealthy and even dangerous, and ignores the very real issues of the very real housewives who were the original targets of those ads. When Tradwives glorify the virtues of being traditionally feminine, the tradition that they're referring to is often the idealized version of white cis-het femininity that existed in the 1950s. Last year, I rewatched every episode of I Love Lucy, and even though Lucille Ball was a total competent badass in real life, on TV she played a quirky screwball housewife who wants to make a name for herself in show business, but constantly self-sabotages and has to be managed by her loving but exasperated husband.
Look, I want you to understand this. You cannot be in this show or in any other show.
Give me one good reason.
I'll give you one good reason. You're a mother.
At the end of each episode, Lucy remembers how fulfilling it is to be a housewife and happily goes back to her domestic duties.
What do you want me to do, Ricky?
You know what I want. I just want you to clean the house.
Oh, I've been doing that ever since I got home.
Notably, there is an absence of diversity in I Love Lucy, as well as in other TV shows and movies from the post-war period. Let's not forget that the 1950s were only a couple of generations away from slavery. There were still people alive in the 1950s who had been slaves. Jim Crow laws were still in effect in many American states, and things weren't much better here in Canada either. Racial segregation was still in effect right up until the 1960s, and it wasn't until 1982 that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms became part of the Constitution, which provided legal protection against discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, and mental or physical disability. Same-sex marriage wasn't legalized in Canada until 2005, and the US took their sweet time with it, only legalizing it in all 50 states in 2015. If you were Black, Indigenous, queer, or neurodivergent in the 1950s, you were effectively barred from participating in the happy nuclear family dream. Segregation laws prevented Black and immigrant families from buying homes in white middle-class suburbs, even if they could afford it. Trans women often had to live their entire lives trying their best to be male and shredding their mental health in the process. Queer women had to suppress their desires and pretend to be straight. Neurodivergent women and women with mental health struggles had to suck it up and pretend like nothing was wrong, regardless of how much they were screaming on the inside. Being a stay-at-home wife and mother can be an extremely lonely and stressful experience, and that's something that these Tradwives never talk about. It's a grueling and often thankless job that requires an immense amount of sacrifice, resilience, and patience. It can be boring and isolating, and it can rob you of a sense of purpose and fulfillment. It's a lifestyle best undertaken only if and when it's something that you genuinely deep down want, regardless of social pressures. Wanting that kind of lifestyle should come from a place of deeply genuine and authentic desire for it, not from a feeling of fear about the state of the world and your place in it, or from a desire to be validated by your society. The problem is when women feel pressured and forced into being housewives without being made aware of the incredibly difficult burdens that come along with it. Women in the 1950s were sold a false bill of goods, and when marriage and motherhood turned out to be a lonely and painful existence for many of them, they were told to suck it up, do your duty, don't talk about your struggles. And when that became too much, they were heavily medicated with barbiturates, or they self-medicated with alcohol and other addictions. A 1962 article from the Saturday Evening Post talked about a notable rise in alcoholism among American housewives. According to the article, since World War II, the number of women drinkers has multiplied dramatically, and so, inevitably, has the number of women who cannot control their drinking. Alcoholism among women was especially stigmatized, and many housewives drank to mask their loneliness and isolation. From the same article, For years, alcohol seemed an efficient crutch. With the drink in her hand, the too busy mother finds the momentary stimulation to face another chore or a moment of calm in the confusion of children's demands, errands, and social obligations. Betty Friedan pointed out that boredom and a sense of meaninglessness plagued the mid-century housewife. Drawing from interviews with 35 British women who were housewives during the post-war years, so from 1945 until about 1960, about half of them reported anxiety or depression, but interestingly, they still valued their roles as wives and mothers. They framed their mental health struggles as a result of being treated badly by their husbands and by society in general, and some attributed their trauma to the stress of growing up during the war. Even though it's a small sample size, the sentiments expressed in these interviews bear out in the stats. The prevalence of TV shows like I Love Lucy and cheerful ads that depicted the American housewife as the happiest person on the planet created a sense of dissatisfaction and shame when real-life women found that their lives weren't measuring up to what had been promised. Kind of like how modern tradwives are dissatisfied with how real-life employment doesn't measure up to the financial security and independence they were promised by second and third wave feminism. And that's about the only thing tradwives actually have in common with 1950s housewives, a sense of being cheated out of what was promised. Betty Friedan wrote in The Feminine Mystique, if a woman had a problem in the 1950s and 1960s, she knew that something must be wrong with her marriage or with herself. She was so ashamed to admit her dissatisfaction that she never knew how many other women shared it. If she tried to tell her husband, he didn't understand what she was talking about. She did not really understand it herself. Psychiatric drugs were prescribed to women en masse, and doctors had begun to refer to women's persistent complaints about fatigue and depression as the housewife syndrome. Beneath the glossy Technicolor surface, things in the 1950s weren't as rosy as they seemed, and it's this reality that modern tradwives on TikTok are purposefully and dangerously ignoring. By mythologizing and idealizing the past, they're ignoring the very real issues that women faced right across the board, whether they fit into the ideal image of the American housewife or not. Why the 1950s? So, why did modern tradwives decide to zero in on the 1950s in particular as the era to emulate? The 1950s was the beginning of the Cold War, and the Red Scare was in full swing. Paranoia over communism, Russian spies, and nuclear weapons abounded, and the idea of American exceptionalism and manifest destiny was an important part of the narrative that drove the US to the status of global superpower at this time. During the post-war period, popular culture and the mass media reinforced messages about traditional gender roles and consumer culture.
You mean to tell me that with this big shindig staring you in the face, you still had time for golf?
Nothing to it. With this kitchen, it's a breeze. Come on over. Look at some of the evidence. By the way, did you know that this kitchen won an award from the Woman's Home Companion?
Women were encouraged to prioritize finding a husband over getting a college degree, and the marriage rate in the U.S. rose to an all-time high.
At 23, she was earning her own living and living her own life. Her work was useful and interesting. And in her time, being a bachelor girl isn't the social disgrace it was when our parents called them spinsters. Phyllis didn't marry because she had to, or because it was a duty. She could take or leave it. But it was the idea of children mostly that made Phyllis say yes. The idea of a life with no one of her own to love and care for seemed to her like only half a life.
Women on TV and in movies were shown in feminine hairdos and delicate dresses, lovingly tending to their homes as they enjoyed the lifestyle provided to them by democracy, capitalism, and freedom. This was propaganda designed to reinforce the idea that the nuclear family was what made America superior to the communists. Propaganda that pitted American-style democracy and capitalism against Soviet communism was central to getting the population on board with the vast amounts of tax dollars that were being spent on nuclear missile programs, weapons development, and CIA intelligence and counterintelligence operations. Wars are expensive, whether they're hot or not, and whenever a nation is at war, a strong sense of nationalism has to come into play as the population is rallied around whatever cause they're going to war about. In the case of the 1950s, it was to protect capitalism and sow the seeds of its neoliberal expansion. The idea of the American nuclear family was central to this agenda because the nuclear family is the ideal environment in which to raise hyper-individualistic consumers on the virtues of hard work and always being busy. Two things which are good for the owner class and for employers, but not so good for actually experiencing the fullness of your own humanity. But I digress. Just like the tradwives of today romanticize the 1950s, Cold War era propaganda also idealized the past. In my last video, I talked briefly about Enlightenment philosophy and how it framed masculinity as being rational and femininity as being soft and irrational. This is why women had been barred from participating in the democratic process when the US was first founded at the end of the 18th century, and why the suffragettes of the early 20th century had to fight so damn hard to win the vote. They were fighting against mid-18th century Enlightenment ideas that had been codified into law when the US was first established. The Founding Fathers grew up steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, and they founded America on it. While there are many good things about Enlightenment philosophy, like democracy, freedom, and striving to live simply and in harmony with nature, it's still fundamentally racist, sexist, and misogynistic. In the writings of philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we find the idea of the noble savage, the backwards, unevolved, i.e. non-white person who lacks the superior reasoning capabilities of the white European man. We also find the idea of white women as being soft, emotional, and eternally angelic creatures who are fundamentally unsuited for the harsh realities of public life. Enlightenment philosophers argued that women shouldn't be forced to participate in things like democracy and education and work outside the home because it would just make them hard and masculine and go against their very nature. Of course, this completely ignores the fact that women have always worked outside the home all throughout history, and only a very privileged few have ever been able to stay at home and cocoon themselves in all the comforts of the domestic sphere. Even after slavery was legally abolished in the United States, Black women still worked almost all of the time, and a lot of the time that work was done in the homes of white families where they were hired as housekeepers and nannies to raise white babies, often at the expense of being able to raise and care for their own children. Where are all the images of happy, beautiful Black women enthusiastically serving their families in high heels and pearls? They don't exist because nuclear family propaganda wasn't made for Black women. Black women were busy working for white families. Emancipation was a very good thing, but all that it had effectively done was remove the right for one human being to legally own another. It didn't mean that Black people, and especially Black women, weren't still enslaved. Cold War pro-capitalist propaganda relied on the Enlightenment idea that white women belong in the domestic sphere because we're naturally too delicate and unsuited for public life. In I Love Lucy, Ricky Ricardo had to bail her out of nearly all of her scrapes because she was too much of a screwball to do that for herself. The propaganda of the 1950s and 1960s was also idealizing a mythological golden age, the age of the Founding Fathers of the late 18th century, when women were feminine and businessmen were allowed to flourish, and democracy was run by men who were reasonable, rational, and much more capable than a silly little woman whose brain would break if she had to run a business or, God forbid, a nation. Once again, historical context is key. Modern Tradwives are romanticizing the 1950s, and the 1950s were romanticizing the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was romanticizing the Roman Republic, and on it goes. Turtles all the way down. The point is that none of these sexist, racist, and expansionist mythologies are actually new, nor are they based in any kind of scientific biological reality. But all of them are convenient because they serve the agendas of whoever is in power, i.e. wealthy white men. When we mythologize history like that and turn a blind eye to the actual facts and reality of it, it sets up a dangerous precedent for things like nationalism and white supremacy to grow and flourish, and it ignores the racist colonial agenda that the US and Canada were actually founded on: white supremacy. Simply ignoring history and some of the more problematic aspects of the past is one thing, but underneath a lot of these Tradwife accounts is something actually sinister. Trump's election in 2016 allowed for alt-right spaces to become louder online and in real life, but they were mostly dominated by men. Far-right militias like the Proud Boys and misogynistic incels like Elliot Rodger are just a couple of the groups that made headlines both in the years just prior to and just after the election of Trump. But it's not like they appeared out of nowhere. Neo-fascist groups have always existed, but Trump's unhinged rhetoric and the hard right that the Republican Party took after he was elected allowed for them to emerge from the shadows and become more public. Notably, there was an absence of women from these spaces, and members of the alt-right began to weigh out whether or not that was actually problematic. One of the most insidious far-right talking points is the manufactured hysteria over declining birth rates in the Western, i.e. white world, and increasing immigration.
So when you change the norm from "it is good to have kids" to "we are utterly indifferent as to whether people have kids," what you end up with is a dying civilization. And that is precisely what we are seeing today.
And the wombs of virtuous white women could be directly useful in stopping the Great Replacement dead in its tracks. The Great Replacement is a neo-fascist conspiracy theory that's meant to spread panic about white people being replaced culturally and demographically by non-white populations. Originally a reaction to the waves of immigration from predominantly Muslim North African countries into France in the early 2010s, it's now unfortunately spread like a cancerous growth into online alt-right spaces and used to drum up support for neo-fascist politicians in the US. The alt-right is driven by conspiracy theories as well as a general dissatisfaction with modern life. As one New York Times article from 2018 pointed out, even before 2020 made things worse, the men on the alt-right might point to diversity initiatives and mass immigration as having dismantled their career prospects. The women are furious that they have to consider career prospects at all. In these online spaces, the Tradwife lifestyle is held up as the answer to male fears of being replaced in the job market and being left behind by the feminist sexual revolution, as well as female fears of being objectified and exposed to sexual violence. The answer to both of these fears, according to alt-right ideology, is for young women to shut up, delete their Instagram accounts, get married, stay home, submit to their husbands, and have lots of white babies to help us return to this fictionalized, propagandized past where the white American nuclear family was the cradle of freedom and security. The Tradwife movement is a way for young women to gain acceptance in white nationalist spaces by volunteering their wombs as a way to fight back against the perceived threats of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Ayla Stewart is a popular Tradwife commentator who makes videos on her YouTube channel about traditional living, parenting, and European cultural homeschooling. A few years ago, she posted a video promoting a white baby challenge where she urged white women to have as many babies as possible to offset the declining birth rates in Western countries. Editing Megan here. I really wanted to find a clip of that video to post for you guys, but it has obviously been deleted because the backlash was insane. So y'all are just gonna have to take my word for it. Not all Tradwives are explicit about their racism, but some, like Caitlin Huber, known online as Mrs. Midwest, and the aforementioned Ayla Stewart, follow and interact with white nationalist accounts online. Women's activism has always been important to the success of white supremacist groups. Only now, instead of sewing Klan uniforms and cooking food for rallies, women on the far right are amassing online as Tradwife influencers. To be clear, not all Tradwives are white supremacists, but there is a significant overlap between those worlds as well as between Tradwives and the world of Christian fundamentalism and Christian nationalism. Religious fundamentalism. Almost inseparable from the Tradwife movement is an undercurrent of religious, i.e. Christian fundamentalism, although Jewish and pagan fundamentalism has been linked to the movement as well. Yes, there is such a thing as pagan fundamentalism, as this practicing pagan was shocked and horrified to find out. Many Tradwives embrace the idea of biblical femininity, in which women shouldn't work, shouldn't vote, and should fully submit to their husband's authority as the head of the household, who in turn submits to Christ's authority and leads his family based on that.
I knew that in marriage, my husband was going to be the leader of the home and the spiritual leader of the home. And I wanted to marry someone that I was going to be completely confident in submitting to him as the leader of our home. And that definitely was something that helped to confirm my choice and also definitely attracted me more to you. The more that I found that he was seeking to pursue God, the more attracted that I was to him.
There's been a lot of news coverage and documentaries since 2006's iconic Jesus Camp about the rise of Christian nationalism in the US. As fundamentalists have risen to power and infiltrated the Supreme Court, the rights of women in the states are being actively dismantled. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, as well as fear-mongering over trans and queer women, have been all over the media these past couple of years, and now there's talk of the fundies coming after no-fault divorce in some states as well. Christian Tradwives have been instrumental in obtaining women's consent to having their rights stripped away. Who needs bodily autonomy when your body belongs to Christ and your husband anyway? Why bother yourself with having to make hard decisions like getting an abortion or changing careers or exploring your sexuality, even if it feels scary, when someone else can just decide those things for you? Religious fundamentalism provides a handy script for living life that dictates what you should and should not do, think, and wear. It takes the decision-making out of life and leaves you with a tried and tested set of rules to follow that simplify and smooth over a lot of the enormous complexities that we're facing as a society. In short, it doesn't require you to think for yourself. Thinking for yourself can be hard and scary. It can involve making hard and scary decisions. I get it. Sometimes it's easier just to submit to the doctrines of a strict faith that emphasizes traditional gender roles than to do the hard work of deep introspection so that you can arrive at a place of self-knowledge and greater authenticity.
Funny enough, I didn't always have the desire to be like a stay-at-home mom, stay-at-home wife. I actually only started really desiring this after I started seeking the Lord and praying to Him and asking Him to allow me to be the best godly wife that I could be and godly woman in general. And I started gaining more and more of these desires to want to be at home and be able to take care of my husband and eventually be able to stay home and raise my children. In university, again, oftentimes we get so focused on our careers, what are we going to do outside of university? And I was finding that although I have a job I love, it still doesn't feel fulfilling. And again, I know your job isn't supposed to be fulfilling, but I know a lot of people are in the careers that they love and that they're so passionate about, but I never had that. But as time continued passing, I noticed that my passion and my desire to have children and be able to take care of a family grew stronger and stronger. It's so unfortunate, the society we live in now, the economy is terrible. You can't even afford anything, so I'm just gonna have to be praying my dreams come true.
If you're scared enough, if you're tired enough, you'll gladly submit to the doctrines of fundamentalist religions, even when they actively work against your own health, safety, well-being, and interests. That's why they can be so attractive, despite the fact that they're often predicated on racism and misogyny. Internalized misogyny and intersectional feminism. At the center of the Venn diagram of the manosphere and Tradwive content is a violent and seething hatred of women, as well as a rejection of feminism. Tradwives are basically the women's equivalent of the manosphere, and some of them even borrow their terminology, calling themselves red pill women. The emphasis in Tradwife spaces is on dating, relationships, and marriage, specifically on how to please men.
Today I'm going to be giving some tips for the ladies on how to attract a masculine man, a provider man. Tip number 1, we are attracting a masculine man. We are not going out of our way and seeking out a man. That is a man's position to pursue. It is our job to receive.
Tradwives are pick-me girls at their worst, doing everything they can to present themselves as the embodiment of sexist male fantasies so that a man will choose them and rescue them from their fears of the future. But by presenting themselves in this way, they're setting up a dichotomy between themselves and other women as they compete for male attention in a zero-sum game that only exists in their heads. If you're a feminine, submissive woman, then you should be white, heterosexual, naturally monogamous, neurotypical, and in your feminine energy. All other women who don't check these boxes are therefore inferior. Tradwife content is made for men and the male gaze as much as it's made to recruit women into far-right spaces. Tradwife influencers pander to male fantasies of female submission and sexual availability while encouraging other women to do the same in real life. Back to the article I referenced in the intro about the couple getting divorced after 12 years because the husband watched too many Tradwife TikToks. Clearly, this strategy works. This kind of content can be dangerous for men as well because it radicalizes them and makes it okay for them to indulge their darkest fantasies of domination and control. It's uncomfortable to question your role in structures of oppression like patriarchy that were built to keep you and people like you at the top. Tradwife content makes it okay for men not to do that hard, uncomfortable, but ultimately necessary inner work and instead lean into those structures of oppression by upholding and defending them. We're now in the fourth wave of feminism, which is more focused on diversity, intersectionality, queerness, and openness about sexual violence and assault. We've been collectively calling into question the failures of late-stage capitalism and the concessions that earlier waves of feminism made to it, as well as the viability of the monogamous nuclear family. As I said earlier, change is scary, and society is becoming less and less split along gendered lines, making all of our roles in it less clear. Tradwife spaces offer the promise of a fulfilling traditionalist relationship for women who dream of a perfect marriage where they can be homemakers who are adored, respected, and cared for by traditionally masculine men who are wealthy, fertile, handsome, and strong, but also tender and kind. As gender and relationship dynamics are shifting rapidly, Tradwives online are aggressively pushing back by romanticizing heterosexuality, monogamy, and traditional gender roles. Tradwives argue that they don't need feminism because feminism has failed them by requiring them to go to work and robbing them of the ability to stay home with their families. But here's the thing, just because you don't need feminism doesn't mean other women don't. Echoing the sentiments of Fannie Lou Hamer, no one is free until everyone's free. Gen Z Tradwives have a very narrow and outdated view of what feminism is, maybe influenced and informed by watching their mothers struggle to balance full-time jobs and full-time parenting, or by the boss babe, hustle hard pop feminism of the early 2000s and 2010s that was popular when they were young. Girl boss feminism encouraged women to pursue individual corporate success even at the expense of group solidarity, intersectionality, and racial justice. Girl boss feminism ignored the need for equity, so once again, just like in the domestic bliss propaganda of the 1950s, neurodivergent women, queer women, immigrant women, women of color, and indigenous women were left out. Tradwives aren't wrong for criticizing the girl boss feminism of the 2010s, but it's like they're running straight into the point and still missing it. Upholding the belief that all women are inferior to all men while hating on and shaming women who do have to go out and work, whether they want to or not, is just feeding into the very systems that these tradwives are afraid of. Capitalism is upheld by patriarchy. You can't separate the two. Girl boss feminism is also inherently tied to capitalism, and it's actually capitalism that the tradwives are critical of, as they should be. Capitalism requires as large a workforce as possible, so it's to the benefit of the owner class to have a pool of women they can exploit for labor at any time. And even in those cases where women can choose not to work, their inevitable subordination still benefits the men who do work. The whole 40-hour work week was predicated on the idea that someone would be home to do full-time domestic labor for free. With the soaring cost of living and the amount of debt that the average person carries, it just isn't possible for most people to afford to do this, yet the hours we're expected to work haven't changed. By ignoring the intersection of capitalism and patriarchy, and by refusing to do the work to unlearn their internalized misogyny, tradwives are unknowingly digging their heels into the very systems that make them want to run for cover in the first place. Despite the image that they portray online, tradwives are working women. Another 2020 study from the Global Network on Extremism and Technology found that despite how loudly they promote traditional gender roles, tradwives have harnessed influencer culture and theories of online marketing to bolster their success by blending the art of social media aesthetics with the science of social media platform management and monetization. Don't be fooled by all the images of cozy domesticity and letting your husband be the breadwinner. These women are earning their own income. Despite urging their followers to rely solely on their husbands for financial support, they themselves are not walking the walk. Estee Williams, one of the most influential tradwives on TikTok, has over 141,000 followers and almost 60,000 subscribers on YouTube. Despite making preachy videos on how to go from 2 incomes to 1,
yes, you're going to sacrifice things and it's well worth it. It's a very balanced lifestyle. It is very normal. We shouldn't be titling this abnormal or extreme or outdated. You can't outdate traditional marriage when it's been a thing since the beginning of time.
According to Social Blade, she makes close to $1,000 a month just from YouTube ad revenue alone. Now, that's a relatively small amount of money, especially in this economy, but the point is it's not $0. She's not relying entirely on her husband to support her, despite urging her followers to do just that. Power imbalances and abuse. Encouraging young women to rely completely on their husbands for financial support is dangerous. It can become a breeding ground for misogynistic men to abuse and control women, and it sets up an inherent power imbalance between men and women who strictly follow traditional gender roles. I'm a single 34-year-old woman. I am not by any stretch of the imagination a relationship expert, nor am I qualified to comment on how to best conduct yourself while in a relationship. Believe me. That being said, I do strongly believe that trust and informed consent should make up the foundations of any healthy relationship, and I would argue that these tradwives are not fully consenting to the relationship dynamics in which they find themselves. They can't because they don't have all the information. If they did, they probably wouldn't be tradwives. As I've already discussed, when fear of the world and fear of the future are the driving forces behind young women getting sucked into these online spaces, they're not acting from a place of genuine desire and authenticity. I'm not saying this is the case for everyone who gets shuffled through this pipeline, but that underlying fear is what these alt-right content creators depend on. Fear of not being able to support yourself, fear of not being chosen by a man, fear of failure, of falling behind, of being deemed unworthy by society, and of never reaching the milestones of adulthood that you were promised growing up. Patriarchy plays into this in a big way because from the day we're born, women are surrounded by messages from culture, from the media, from religion, and from our communities that in order to be valid and worthy, we need to be chosen by a man. I mean, come on, that's literally the plot of every Disney princess movie before Frozen. If we don't do the work to actively decenter men and question their roles in our lives, it becomes very easy to get sucked into the orbit of men who are also unhealed and who carry a deeply internalized hatred of women. We've all seen those TikTok videos of shut up rings and men giving just like the worst vows at the altar that make it painfully clear how much hatred and contempt they have for their wives.
I promise to smack ass every chance I get. That's all I got.
Is that it? Come on, Cody. Are you sure?
I didn't write nothing down.
That's what you're going out with?
That's what I'm going with.
Cool.
We've made it this long.
Only two things are required to keep me happy. Keep my belly full and my balls empty. So you're amazing at half of it. We really need to get you some cooking lessons.
These are the kinds of men who are attracted to tradwives and who seek out passive, submissive women who they can dominate and control. I've talked a lot about women's backlash against shifting gender roles and norms, but there's a huge backlash from young men as well. Pretty much everything in the manosphere, from pickup artists to incels to white nationalists to Christian fundamentalists, is a reaction to men on the left who are actively unlearning patriarchy and actually getting in touch with themselves. In my last video, I talked about the conservative reaction to the trend of straight men wearing skirts, and that's just like one facet of it. There are many. Men who expect women to be submissive and uphold traditional ideas of femininity are also scared for their place in the world. But instead of looking inward and asking themselves how they can adapt to the changing landscape of relationships and work and gender roles, they project all of their fears and insecurities onto women, blaming feminists for not giving them the sex and the relationships that they feel entitled to, or looking to feel powerful again by controlling and abusing their wives. Young women and teenage girls who consume tradwife content because they're looking for security and a sense of refuge are actually putting themselves in danger of attracting these kinds of men. Getting into a relationship, or God forbid marrying a man who deep down hates women, will ultimately end up making life a whole lot worse for them a lot sooner than the grueling realities of this late-stage capitalist hellscape will. Fear of collapse. Tradwives often use the language of choice when defending themselves. If you were really feminists, you wouldn't judge our choices to stay home or something along those lines. But as Rottenberg and Orgad pointed out in an article written for The Conversation in 2020, our choices do not exist in a vacuum. They're always shaped by social, economic, and political conditions. A lot of tradwives talk about the physical, mental, and emotional strain of working a job and then coming home to endless household chores and the needs of their children and husbands. Just an aside, if you hear like a rumbling sound in the background, that is my dog snoring. Guys, like, he snores louder than a human with sleep apnea, I swear to God. I remember my mom saying so many times while I was growing up that the only thing feminism had achieved is to double women's workloads and saddle them with 2 full-time jobs instead of just 1. My mom is not and never was a tradwife, at least in the political sense, but she echoes a very real and very common sentiment among a lot of women who find themselves facing a lot of pressure to have it all. When it comes to raising children and looking after elderly family members, the burden of care still largely falls on women. Fourth wave feminism fights against this by pointing out that a lot of men in heterosexual marriages still aren't pulling their weight, using tactics like weaponized incompetence to get out of doing chores or taking an active role in raising their kids.
Hey, what? Okay? You want me to change it? Yeah, dude!
Videos like that get me so heated. What do you mean? Do you want me to change him? And I don't know that man. It's possible that he's an incredible person who had a moment of weakness. Based on her reaction to that, I know that's not the first time he's done that. This is a repeated offense. Welcome to my channel. I help people make informed decisions about whether or not they want kids. Huge part of that decision is who you are having those kids with. There are so many people out there, a lot of times men, and they will see a problem and then ask you if you want them to fix it. Why not just fix it? Like, why not just fix it? This is what it is. He doesn't consider it a problem for him. He doesn't consider it his problem. He is, in his mind, doing her a favor by fixing one of her problems. And what he doesn't realize is that he is just as much of a parent as she is. That poopy diaper is just as much his responsibility as it is hers. But I don't think it's malicious. I just think he's not thinking. They don't think, and then we, as women, have to think for them, which is so exhausting.
Even when the man does his share of the domestic load on a regular basis without complaining about it or having to be asked, the mental load of organizing the household, knowing what needs to get done, and making sure everyone has everything they need at all times still falls largely on women's shoulders. That is exhausting, and many women are pointing this out and challenging men to step up to the plate and take ownership of the domestic sphere. I could do a whole other video just on that, and at some point I probably will, but it relates to tradwives in that it just adds to the burdens that many women face both at home and at work, which feeds into the talking points of these tradwives online. especially women my age and younger who have faced a job market full of nothing but precarious employment for all of our adult lives thus far. Because of the lack of solid employment, many of us who do work feel pressured to be on at all times, and it's led to a rise in this toxic, always on, hustle hard work culture that us millennial women have fallen victim to and sadly often perpetuate. When we do find work, we cling to it for dear life, and there's an expectation that we have zero boundaries to protect our work-life balance. This has been a huge driving factor behind these alt-right spaces where tradwife content is allowed to flourish, and the choices of women who identify as tradwives need to be understood and examined in the context of this crisis of work and domestic care under neoliberal capitalism. A 2021 study by the Political Research Associates argues that a fear of imminent collapse among millennials and Gen Z is a large part of what's motivating the tradwife movement online. Collapse, as an all-encompassing term, includes mass displacement, economic depression, food scarcity as agricultural production fails, political upheaval, the end of non-renewable resources, disease, war, and irremediable climate change. Eco-anxiety in particular is common, with many Zoomers and millennials feeling that climate change has robbed them of their future before they've had a chance to enjoy it. The study goes on to argue that the anger and helplessness many people my age and younger feel about our future and about the state of the world makes us vulnerable to extremist far-right movements that offer simple explanations and handy boogeymen, i.e. feminism and the woke left, that we can blame for the state of the world. The nostalgia for a mythic past in which gender norms are dictated by a clear division of labor, or the reinforcement of social status according to biological masculinity and femininity, becomes appealing. In short, the trad movements may be displacing the anxiety young people feel about collapse onto anxieties about relationships and gender. Tradwives seek out male protection in a dangerous future and freedom from the burden of having to find their way in an increasingly uncertain world racked by significant and unprecedented challenges. I have a lot of empathy for this fear. It's very real, and their critiques of corporate feminism are valid. Leading into capitalism isn't going to liberate anyone, women included. Girl boss feminism should be critiqued because all it does is serve to uphold and perpetuate the system that got us into this scary, uncertain future in the first place. But leaning into alt-right spaces online isn't the answer either. When you sit down and really listen to what these tradwives are saying, at the heart of all their sexist, anti-progressive rhetoric is a legitimate argument. It shouldn't be this hard just to survive. What tradwives are really critiquing is neoliberal capitalism, not feminism. What tradwives really long for is not a return to some ahistorical, idealized past, but to be able to do work that is meaningful and fulfilling while being taken care of financially, so they don't have to worry about money or security or not being able to pay the bills. What they really want is a universal basic income. So, do you want to be a tradwife or do you want a universal basic income? A little while ago, I came across a TikTok video where a woman was criticizing tradwives. She said that it sounds like what they really want is a universal basic income, and that's what got me thinking about this whole tradwife thing in the first place.
I think women are mistaking wanting to be a tradwife and a stay-at-home girlfriend with just wanting universal basic income. Women are getting on this app and being like, I'm so tired from all this endless labor and minimal reward and these high costs of living. I wish a man would just provide for me. There is a man that should be providing for you. He should be providing for all of us. His name is Joe Biden.
For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept, universal basic income, or UBI, is a form of social welfare in which all citizens receive a minimum income from their government on a regular basis, free of conditions, without having to work for it. This income would cover all their basic needs and expenses, thereby reducing poverty and injecting more spending power into the economy. The UBI model has been criticized by people on the left and the right, both for feeding into capitalist systems because it can create more consumers, and for igniting all those unhinged conservative fears about lazy welfare creeps and bums that would just take advantage of the system. But the actual data tells a very different and very compelling story. In 1974, a UBI program was tested in the rural town of Dauphin, Manitoba. During the 4 years that the program ran, each family in the town was guaranteed an annual income of $16,000, which would be the equivalent of $91,768 today when adjusted for inflation. That's a whole lot of dough, you guys. How many of you make $91,000 a year? Because I don't, let me tell you that. Over the course of those 4 years, hospitalizations decreased by 8.5%, primarily due to a notable reduction in alcohol-related accidents and mental health crises. There was also a reduction in visits to family physicians, and people were able to open businesses because their increased income meant that banks were more willing to give them loans. This increased the economic health of the town overall and created jobs for people who wanted a little extra income on top of what they were already getting from the government. Education also benefited, as there were less high school dropouts due to a need to go to work and earn an income as soon as possible. The rate of students graduating from high school rose to 100% in 1976, outpacing that of bigger cities like Winnipeg. Families were able to afford to take their kids to the dentist, some of them for the first time ever. Over the years, there have been a handful of UBI experiments and test pilots in other communities in the Western world, and all of them have shown similar results. When people have adequate income, they're more likely to open businesses, go back to school, and do things that benefit their families and communities. They're able to access better health and dental care, and they can afford better and more nutritious food. You know, all of those things that lead to increased overall health, well-being, energy levels, and productivity. It's almost as if when you make it not impossible for people to survive, they actually become more productive. Weird. Baking pies is not the answer. Universal basic income uplifts everyone. When paired with initiatives for greater equity, it has the potential to significantly increase everyone's health, well-being, and happiness. I've already talked about how fourth wave feminism is centered on intersectionality, and I strongly believe that as feminists, we should be getting involved with movements that advocate for universal healthcare and universal basic income instead of tearing each other apart over frilly aprons and blue hair. There are organizations, lobby groups, and think tanks in many Western democratic countries currently fighting for universal basic income. UBI Works is a nonpartisan lobby group here in Canada that's fighting for a nationwide implementation of a universal basic income, and I volunteer with them from time to time. It's a practical and proven solution that has good data to back it up, and it has the potential to solve a lot of the crises we're currently facing as a society. It would go a long way towards solving our housing and cost of living problems, not to mention that the genius who comes up with a solution to climate change just might exist somewhere out there right now, buried under grinding poverty that renders them too overworked and exhausted to actually think of and implement that solution. UBI Works is also nonpartisan, so even if your politics lean to the right, you'll still be welcomed. I'll leave a link to them down in the description below, so if you're Canadian and you're interested, you can check them out. And if you're listening to all this thinking, yeah, that all sounds great and like unicorns, pie in the sky, rainbows, blah, 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 wouldn't we all love to live in a world like that? But how can we afford it though? Well, UBI Works has a number of answers to those questions, so I'm not going to cover them in this video because I've already gone on and on and on for a very long time. But if you're interested and you have questions about how we can afford a UBI and practical steps towards implementing it, go check out UBI Works. Seriously, they're awesome. Link is in the description below once again. I'm not sure what the American or British or Australian versions of UBI Works are because I'm Canadian, so I haven't looked into what other countries are doing. I'm just focused on what my country is doing. But if you want to do meaningful work towards making yours and everyone else's futures look a little more solid, then if you live in one of those other places, then it's worth checking out if there's something similar where you are. If you're a young woman watching this and you feel scared about your future, volunteering with an organization like this is a good way to take some active steps towards getting that protection and security that you crave. Relying on one man to support you and make all your decisions is only going to endanger you that much more quickly and acutely than capitalism and climate change will. Believe me, I did that and it did put me in danger, but that's another story for another day. You can always quit your terrible job, but it's much harder to escape a relationship in which you're totally dependent on your partner and they have absolute power and authority over you, especially if you have children with that man. Baking pies is not the answer. It's fun, I love to bake too, but it's not going to get you the security that you crave. Along with supporting a universal basic income, I would also encourage you to start decentering men from your life. You don't need their approval or their validation. Being chosen by a man who can't even choose to question what he's been taught doesn't mean anything, believe me. It doesn't make you worthy and it doesn't make you more feminine. You already are worthy. The men who are actively looking for a trad wife will choose literally anyone who agrees to serve and cater to them and tiptoe around their egos. You're better than that. You deserve better than that, and you're worth so much more than that. Okay, that's going to do it, my loves. This was a long one, but it's a topic I feel very strongly about, clearly, and I hope that I've given you some food for thought or some key takeaways or maybe a different perspective on this whole trad wife thing. If you have opinions, experiences, or observations about this topic, drop a comment down below because I'd love to hear from you. Just please keep it respectful in the comment section. This is a hot topic and debates can get weird, so I don't want anyone devolving into like unhelpful rhetoric. Let's try to stay supportive of one another. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I recently reached my goal of 1,000 subscribers, and I'm so excited and grateful to all of you because I couldn't have done it without you, and that was one of my first goals for this channel. So I'm really excited that I hit that milestone. Let's see where we can take it from here. Thank you to everyone who's supported the channel thus far. I seriously could not have done it without you. I hope that you all have a lovely day, and I'll be back soon with another video. Toodaloo.